This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on February 19th, 2006. Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, translated by John Ormsby, Part 1. Second part of the Translator's Preface. With his crippled left hand, promotion in the army was hopeless. Now that Don John was dead, and he had no one to press his claims and services, and for a man drawing on 40, life in the ranks was a dismal prospect. He had already a certain reputation as a poet. He made up his mind, therefore, to cast his lot with literature, and for a first venture committed his Galeta to the press. It was published, as Salva y Malen shows conclusively, at Alcala, his own birthplace, in 1585, and no doubt helped to make his name more widely known, but certainly did not do him much good in any other way. While it was going through the press, he married Doña Catalina de Palacio Salazar y Vosimadio, a lady of Esquivas, near Madrid, and apparently a friend of the family, who brought him a fortune which may possibly have served to keep the wolf from the door, but if so, that was all. The drama had by this time outgrown marketplace stages and strolling companies, and with his old love for it he naturally turned to it for congenial employment. In about 3 years he wrote 20 or 30 plays, which he tells us were performed without any throwing of cucumbers or other missiles, and ran their course without any hisses, outcries, or disturbances. In other words, his plays were not bad enough to be hissed off the stage, but not good enough to hold their own upon it. Only 2 of them have been preserved, but as they happen to be 2 of the 7 or 8 he mentions with complacency, we may assume they are favorable specimens, and no one who reads the Numancia and the Trato d'Argel will feel any surprise that they failed as acting dramas. Whatever merits they might have, whatever occasional they may show, they are, as regards construction, incurably clumsy. How completely they failed is manifest from the fact that, with all his sanguine temperament and indomitable perseverance, he was unable to maintain the struggle to gain a livelihood as a dramatist for more than 3 years. Nor was the rising popularity of Lope the cause, as was often said, notwithstanding his own words to the contrary. When Lope began to write for the stage is uncertain, but it was certainly after Cervantes went to Seville. Among the Nuevos Documentos, printed by Señor Arsenio y Toledo, is one dated 1592, and curiously characteristic of Cervantes, it is an agreement with one Rodrigo Osirio, a manager, who was to accept 6 comedies at 50 ducats apiece, not to be paid in any case unless it appeared on representation that the said comedy was one of the best that had ever been represented in Spain. The test does not seem to have been ever applied. Perhaps it was sufficiently apparent to Rodrigo Osirio that the comedies were not among the best that had ever been represented. Among the correspondence of Cervantes there might have been found, no doubt, more than one letter, like we see in the Rake's Progress. "Sir, I have read your play, and it will not do." He was more successful in a literary contest at Saragossa in 1595, in honor of the canonization of San Jacinto, when his composition won the first prize, 3 silver spoons. The year before this he had been appointed a collector of revenues for the kingdom of Granada. In order to remit the money he had collected more conveniently to the treasury, he entrusted it to a merchant, who failed and absconded, and as the bankrupt's assets were insufficient to cover the whole, he was sent to prison at Seville in September of 1597. The balance against him, however, was a small one, about 261, and on giving security for it, he was released at the end of the year. It was as he journeyed from town to town collecting the king's taxes that he noted down those bits of inn and wayside life and character that abound in the pages of Don Quixote. the Benedictine monks with their spectacles and sunshades, mounted on their tall mules, the strollers in costume bound for the next village, the barber with his basin on his head on his way to bleed a patient, the recruit with his breeches in his bundle, tramping along the roads singing, the reapers gathered in the Venta gateway, listening to Felix Marte of Hircania read out to them, and those little Hogarthian touches that he so well knew how to bring in, the oxtail hanging up with the landlord's comb stuck in it, the wine-skins at the bedhead, and those notable examples of hostelry art, Helen going off in high spirits on Paris's arm, and Dido on the tower dropping tears as big as walnuts. Nay, it may well be said that on those journeys into remote regions he came across now and then a specimen of the pauper gentleman, with his lean hack and his greyhound and his boots of chivalry, dreaming away his life in happy ignorance that the world had changed since his great-grandfather's old helmet was new. But it was in Seville that he found out his true vocation, though he himself would not by any means have admitted it be so. It was here, in Triana, that he was first tempted to try his hand at drawing from life, and first brought his humour into play in the exquisite little sketch of Rinconete e Cortadillo, the germ, in more ways than one, of Don Quixote. Where and when that was written we cannot tell. After his imprisonment, all trace of Cervantes in his official capacity disappears, from which it may be inferred that he was not reinstated. That he was still in Seville in November of 1598 appears from a satirical sonnet of his on the elaborate catafalque erected to testify to the grief of the city at the death of Philip II. But from this up to 1603 we have no clue to his movements. The words in the preface of the first part of Don Quixote are generally held to be conclusive that he conceived the idea of the book, and wrote the beginning of it at least, in a prison, and that he may have done so is extremely likely. There is a tradition that Cervantes read some portions of his work to a select audience at the Duke of Bejar's, which may have helped to make the book known. But the obvious conclusion is that the first part of Don Quixote lay on his hands some time before he could find a publisher bold enough to undertake a venture of so novel a character, and so little faith in it had Francisco Robles of Madrid, to whom at last he sold it, that he did not care to incur the expense of securing the copyright for Aragon or Portugal, contenting himself with that for Castile. The printing was finished in December, and the book came out with the new year, 1605. It is often said that Don Quixote was at first received coldly. The facts show just the contrary. No sooner was it in the hands of the public than preparations were made to issue pirated editions at Lisbon and Valencia, and to bring out a second edition with the additional copyrights for Aragon and Portugal, which he secured in February. No doubt it was received with something more than coldness by certain sections of the community. Men of wit, taste, and discrimination among the aristocracy gave it a hearty welcome, but the aristocracy in general was not likely to relish a book that turned their favourite reading into ridicule, and laughed at so many of their favourite ideas. The dramatists who gathered round Lope as their leader regarded Cervantes as their common enemy, and it is plain that he was equally obnoxious to the other clique. The culto poets, who had Gongora for their chief, Navarrete, who knew nothing of the letter above mentioned, tries hard to show that the relations between Cervantes and Lope were of a very friendly sort, as indeed they were until Don Quixote was written. Cervantes, indeed, to the last, generously and manfully declared his admiration of Lope's powers, his unfailing invention, and his marvellous fertility. But in the preface of the first part of Don Quixote, and in the verses of Urganda the Unknown, and one or two other places, there are, if we read between the lines, sly hits at Lope's vanities and affections that argue no personal goodwill. And Lope openly sneers at Don Quixote and Cervantes, and 14 years after his death gives him only a few lines of cold commonplace in the Laurel de Apollo that seem all the colder for the eulogies of a host of nonentities whose names are found nowhere else. In 1601 Valladolid was made the seat of the court, and in the beginning of 1603 Cervantes had been summoned thither in connection with the balance due by him to the treasury, which was still outstanding. He remained at Valladolid, apparently supporting himself by agencies and scrivener's work of some sort, probably drafting petitions and drawing up statements of claims to be presented to the council and the like. So, at least, we gather from the depositions taken on the occasion of the death of a gentleman, the victim of a street brawl, who had been carried into the house in which he lived. In these he himself is described as a man who wrote and transacted business, and it appears that his household then consisted of his wife, the natural daughter Isabel de Saavedra, already mentioned, his sister Andrea, now a widow, her daughter Constanza, a mysterious Magdalena de Sotomayor, calling herself his sister, for whom his biographers cannot account, and a servant maid. Meanwhile, Don Quixote had been growing in favor, and its author's name was now known beyond the Pyrenees. In 1607 an edition was printed at Brussels. Robles, the Madrid publisher, found it necessary to meet the demand by a third edition, the seventh in all, in 1608. The popularity of the book in Italy was such that a Milan bookseller was led to bring out an edition in 1610, and another was called for in Brussels in 1611. It might naturally have been expected that, with such proofs before him that he had hit the taste of the public, Cervantes would have set at once about redeeming his rather vague promise of a second volume. But to all appearance nothing was further from his thoughts. He had still by him one or two short tales of the same vintage as those he had inserted in Don Quixote, and instead of continuing the adventures of Don Quixote, he set to work to write more of these novelas exemplares, as he afterward called them, with a view toward making a book of them. The novels were published in the summer of 1613, with a dedication to the Conde de Lemos, the Maecenas of the day, and with one of those chatty confidential prefaces Cervantes was so fond of. In this, 8 years and a half after the first part of Don Quixote had appeared, we get the first hint of a forthcoming second part. "You shall see shortly," he says, "the further exploits of Don Quixote and humours of Sancho Panza." His idea of shortly was a somewhat elastic one, for, as we know by the date to Sancho's letter, he had barely one half of the book completed, that time 12 months. But more than poems or pastorals or novels, it was his dramatic ambition that engrossed his thoughts. The same indomitable spirit that kept him from despair in the bagnios of Algiers, and prompted him to attempt the escape of himself and his comrades again and again, made him persevere in spite of failure and discouragement in his efforts to win the ear of the public as a dramatist. The temperament of Cervantes was essentially sanguine. The portrait he draws in the preface to the novels, with the aquiline features, chestnut hair, smooth untroubled forehead, and bright cheerful eyes, is the very portrait of a sanguine man. Nothing that the managers might say could persuade him that the merits of his plays would not be recognized at last if they were only given a fair chance. The old soldier of the Spanish Salamis was bent on being the Aeschylus of Spain. He was to found a great national drama based on the true principles of art, that was to be the envy of all nations. He was to drive from the stage the silly, childish plays, the mirrors of nonsense and models of folly that were in vogue, through the cupidity of the managers and short-sightedness of the authors. He was to correct and educate the public taste until it was ripe for tragedies on the model of the Greek drama, like the Numancia, for instance, and the comedies that would not only amuse but improve and instruct. All this he was to do could he once get a hearing, and that was the initial difficulty. He shows plainly enough, too, that Don Quixote and the demolition of the chivalry romances was not the work that lay next to his heart. He was, indeed, he says to himself in his preface, more a stepfather than a father to Don Quixote. Never was great work so neglected by its author. That it was written carelessly, hastily, and by fits and starts was not always his fault, but it seems clear that he never read what he sent to the press. He knew how the printers had blundered, but he never took the trouble to correct them when the third edition was in progress, as a man who really cared for the child of his brain would have done. He appears to have regarded the book as little more than a mere libro de entretenimiento, an amusing book, a thing, as he says in the Viaje, to divert the melancholy, moody heart at any time or season. No doubt he had an affection for his hero, and was very proud of Sancho Panza. It would have been strange indeed if he had not been proud of the most humorous creation in all fiction. He was proud, too, of the popularity and success of the book, and beyond measure delightful is the naivete with which he shows his pride in a dozen messages in the second part. But it was not the success he coveted. In all probability, he would have given all the success of Don Quixote, nay, he would have seen every copy of Don Quixote burned in the Plaza Mayor, for such success as Lope de Vega was enjoying on an average once a week. And so he went on, dawdling over Don Quixote, adding a chapter now and then, and putting it aside to turn to Persiles and Sigismunda, which, as we know, was to be the most entertaining book in the language, and the rival of Theagenes and Charcelea, or finishing off one of his darling comedies. And if Robles had asked when Don Quixote would be ready, the answer, no doubt, was en breve, shortly. There was enough time for that. At 68 he was as full of life and hope and plans for the future as a boy of 18. Nemesis was coming, however. He had got as far as chapter 59, which, at his leisurely pace, he could hardly have reached before October or November of 1614, when there was put into his hand a small octave lately printed at Tarragona, and calling itself Second Volume of the Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, by the licentiate Alonso Fernandez de Alvenada of Tordesillas. The last part of chapter 59, and most of the following chapters of the second part, give us some idea of the effect produced upon him, and his irritation was not likely to be lessened by the reflection that he had no one to blame but himself. Had Avellaneda, in fact, been content with merely bringing out a continuation to Don Quixote, Cervantes would have had no reasonable grievance. His own intentions were expressed in the very vaguest language, and at the end of the book. Nay, in his last words he seems actually to invite someone to continue the work, and he made no sign until 8 years and a half had gone by which time Alvaneda's volume was no doubt written. In fact, Cervantes had no case, or a very bad one, as far as the mere continuation was concerned. But Avellaneda had chosen to write a preface to it, full of such coarse personal abuse as only an ill-conditioned man could pour out. He taunts Cervantes with being old, with having lost his hand, with having been in prison, with being poor, with being friendless, accuses him of envy of Lope's success, of petulance and querulousness, and so on. And it was in this that the sting lay. Avellanada's reason for this personal attack is obvious enough. Whoever he may have been, it is clear that he was one of the dramatists of Lope's school, for he has the impudence to charge Cervantes with attacking him as well as Lope in his criticism on the drama. His identification has exercised the best critics and baffled all the ingenuity and research that has been brought to bear on it. Navarrete and Ticknor both incline to the belief that Cervantes knew who he was, but I must say that I think the anger he shows suggests an invisible assailant. It is like the irritation of a man stung by a mosquito in the dark. Cervantes, from certain solecisms of language, pronounces him to be an Aragonese, and Pellicier, an Aragonese himself, supports this view, and believes him, moreover, to have been an ecclesiastic, a Dominican probably. Any merit Avellaneda has is reflected from Cervantes, and he is too dull to reflect much. Dull and dirty will always be, I imagine, the verdict of the vast majority of unprejudiced readers. He is at best a poor plagiarist. All he can do is follow slavishly the lead given him by Cervantes. His only humor lies in making Don Quixote take inns for castles, and fancy himself some legendary or historical personage, and Sancho mistake words, invert proverbs, and display his gluttony. All through he shows a proclivity to coarseness and dirt, and he has contrived to introduce two tales filthier than anything by the 16th-century novelieri, and without their sprightliness. But whatever Avellaneda and his book may be, we must not forget the debt we owe them. But for them there can be no doubt Don Quixote would have come to us a mere torso instead of a complete work. Even if Cervantes had finished the volume he had in hand, most assuredly he would have left off with a promise of a third part, giving the further adventures of Don Quixote and humours of Sancho Panza as shepherds. It is plain that he had at one time an intention of dealing with the pastoral romances as he had dealt with the books on chivalry, but for Avellaneda he would probably have tried to carry it out. But it is more likely that with his pains and projects and hopefulness the volume would have remained unfinished till his death than that we should never have made the acquaintance of the Duke and Duchess, or gone with Sancho to Barataria. From the moment the book came into his hands, he seems to have been haunted by the fear that there might be more Avellanedas in the field, and putting everything else aside, he set himself to finish off his task and protect Don Quixote in the only way he could, by killing him. The conclusion is no doubt a hasty and in some places clumsy piece of work, and the frequent repetition of the scolding administered to Avellaneda becomes, in the end, rather wearisome. But it is, in any rate, a conclusion, and for that we must thank Avellaneda. The new volume was ready for the press in February, but was not printed until the very end of 1615. And during the interval Cervantes put together the comedies and interludes he had written in the last few years, and, as he adds plaintively, found no demand for among the managers, and published them with a preface, worth the book it introduces tenfold, in which he gives an account of the early Spanish stage, and of his own attempts as a dramatist. It is needless to say that they were put forward by Cervantes in all good faith and full confidence of their merits. The reader, however, was not to suppose they were his last word or final effort in the drama, for he had in hand a comedy called Engaño a los Ochos, about which, if he mistook not, there would be no question. Of this dramatic masterpiece the world has no opportunity of judging. His health had been failing for some time, and he died, apparently of dropsy, on the 23rd of April, 1616, the day on which the English lost Shakespeare, nominally at least, for the English calendar had not yet been reformed. He died as he had lived, accepting his lot bravely and cheerfully. Was it an unhappy life, that of Cervantes? His biographers all tell us that it was, but I must say I doubt it. It was a hard life, a life of poverty, of incessant struggle, of toil ill-paid, of disappointment, but Cervantes carried within himself the antidote to all these evils. His was not one of those light natures that rise above adversity merely by virtue of their buoyancy. It was in the fortitude of a high spirit that he was proof against it. It is impossible to conceive Cervantes giving way to despondency or prostrated by dejection. As for poverty, it was with him a thing to be laughed over, and the only sigh he ever allows to escape him is when he says, "Happy he whom heaven has given a piece of bread, for which he is not bound to give thanks to any but heaven itself. Add to all this his vital energy and mental activity, his restless invention and his sanguine temperament, and there will be reason enough to doubt that this could have been a very unhappy life. He who could take Cervantes' distresses together with its apparatus for enduring them would not make so bad a bargain, perhaps, as far as happiness in life is concerned. Of his burial place nothing is known, except that he was buried, in accordance with his will, in the neighbouring convent of Trinitarian nuns, of which it is supposed his daughter, Miguel de Cervantes, was an inmate, and that a few years afterward the nuns removed to another convent, carrying their dead with them. But whether the remains of Cervantes were included in the removal or not, no one knows, and the clue to their resting place is now lost beyond all hope. This furnishes perhaps the least defensible of the items in the charge of neglect brought against his contemporaries. In some of the others there is a good deal of exaggeration. To listen to most of his biographers, one would suppose that all Spain was in league not only against the man, but against his memory, or at least that it was insensible to his merits, and left him to live in misery and die of want. To talk of his hard life and unworthy employments in Andalusia is absurd. What had he done to distinguish him from thousands of other struggling men earning a precarious livelihood? True, he was a gallant soldier who had been wounded, and had undergone captivity and suffering in his country's cause, but there were hundreds of others in the same case. He had written a mediocre specimen of an insipid class of romance, and some plays which manifestly did not comply with the primary condition of pleasing. Were the playgoers to patronize plays that did not amuse them, because the author was to produce Don Quixote 20 years afterward? The scramble for copies, which, as we have seen, followed immediately upon the appearance of the work, does not look like general insensibility to its merits. No doubt it was received coldly by some, but if a man writes a book of ridicule of periwigs, he must make his account with being coldly received by the periwig wearers, and hated by the whole tribe of wig-makers. If Cervantes had other chivalry romance readers, the sentimentalists, the dramatists, and the poets of the period, all against him, it was because Don Quixote was what it was, and if the general public did not come forward to make him comfortable for the rest of his days, it was no more to be charged with neglect and ingratitude than the English-speaking public that did not pay off Scott's liabilities. It did the best it could. It read his book, and liked it, and bought it, and encouraged the bookseller to pay him well for others. It has been also made a reproach to Spain that she has erected no monument to the man she is proudest of, no monument, that is to say, of him, for the bronze statue in the little garden of the Plaza de las Cortes, a fair work of art, no doubt, and unexceptional had it been set up to the local poet in the marketplace of some provincial town, is not worthy of Cervantes or of Madrid. But what need has Cervantes of such weak witness of his name? Or what could a monument do in his case except testify to the self-glorification of those who had put it up? The nearest bookseller's shop will show what bathos there would be in a monument to the author of Don Quixote. 9 editions of the first part of Don Quixote had already appeared before Cervantes died, 30,000 copies in all, according to his own estimate, and a 10th was printed at Barcelona the year after his death. So large a number naturally supplied the demand for some time, but by 1634 it appears to have been exhausted, and from that time down to the present day the stream of editions has continued to flow rapidly and regularly. The translations show still more clearly in what request the book has been from the very outset. In 7 years from the completion of the work it had been translated into the 4 leading languages of Europe. Except the Bible, in fact, no book has been so widely diffused as Don Quixote. The Imitatio Christi may have been translated into as many different languages, and perhaps Robinson Crusoe and the Vicar of Wakefield into nearly as many, but in multiplicity of translations and editions, Don Quixote leaves them all far behind. Still more remarkable is the character of this wide diffusion. Don Quixote has been thoroughly naturalized among people whose ideas about knight-errantry, if they had any at all, were of the vaguest, who had never seen or heard a book of chivalry, who could not possibly feel the humor of the burlesque or sympathize with the author's purpose. Another curious fact is that this, the most cosmopolitan book in the world, is one of the most intensely national. Manon Lescaut is not more thoroughly French, Tom Jones not more English, Rob Roy not more Scotch than Don Quixote is Spanish, in character, in ideas, in sentiment, in local color, in everything. What, then, is the secret of this unparalleled popularity, increasing year by year for well-nigh 3 centuries? One explanation, no doubt, is that of all the books in the world, Don Quixote is the most catholic. There is something in it for every sort of reader, young or old, sage or simple, high or low. As Cervantes himself says with a touch of pride, it is thumbed and read and got by heart by people of all sorts. The children turn its leaves, the young people read it, the grown men understand it, the old folks praise it. But it would be idle to deny that the ingredient which, more than its humor or its wisdom, or the fertility of invention or knowledge of the human nature it displays, has ensured its success with the multitude, is the vein of farce that runs through it. It was the attack upon the sheep, the battle with the wineskins, Mambrino's helmet, the balsam of Fierabras, Don Quixote knocked over by the sails of a windmill, Sancho tossed in a blanket, the mishaps and misadventures of master and man that were originally the great attraction, and perhaps are so still to some extent with the majority of readers. It is plain that Don Quixote was generally regarded at first, indeed in Spain for a long time, as little more than a queer, droll book full of laughable incidents and absurd situations, very amusing, but not entitled to much consideration or care. All the editions printed in Spain from 1637 to 1771, when the famous printer Ibarra took it up, were mere trade editions, badly and carelessly printed on vile paper, and got up in the style of chapbooks, intended only for popular use, with, in most instances, uncouth illustrations and claptrap additions by the publisher. To England belongs the credit of having been the first country to recognize the right of Don Quixote to better treatment than this. The London edition of 1738, commonly called Lord Carteret's, from having been suggested by him, was not a mere edition de luxe. It produced Don Quixote in becoming form as regards paper and type, embellished with plates which, if not particularly happy as illustrations, were at least well-intentioned and well executed. But it also aimed at correctness of text, a matter to which nobody except the editors of the Valencia and Brussels editions had given even a passing thought, and for a first attempt it was fairly successful, for though some of its emendations are inadmissible, a good many of them have been adopted by all subsequent editors. The zeal of publishers, editors, and annotators brought about a remarkable change of sentiment with regard to Don Quixote. A vast number of its admirers began to grow ashamed of laughing over it. It became almost a crime to treat it as a humorous book. The humor was not entirely denied, but, according to the new view, it was rated as an altogether secondary quality, a mere accessory, nothing more than the stalking horse under the presentation of which Cervantes shot his philosophy or satire, or whatever it was he meant to shoot, for on this point opinions varied. All were agreed, however, that the object he aimed at was not the books of chivalry. He said emphatically in the preface to the first part, and in the last sentence of the second, that he had no other object in view than to discredit these books, and these, to advanced criticism, made it clear that his object must have been something else. One theory was that the book was a kind of allegory, setting forth the eternal struggle between the ideal and the real, between the spirit of poetry and the spirit of prose, and perhaps German philosophy never evolved a more ungainly or unlikely camel out of the depths of its inner consciousness. Something of the antagonism, no doubt, is to be found in Don Quixote, because it is to be found everywhere in life, and Cervantes drew from life. It is difficult to imagine a community in which the never-ceasing game of cross-purposes between Sancho Panza and Don Quixote would not be recognized as true to nature. In the Stone Age, among lake-dwellers, among the cave-men, there were Don Quixotes and Sancho Panzas. There must have been the troglodyte who could never see the facts before his eyes, and the troglodyte who could see nothing else. But to suppose Cervantes deliberately setting himself to expound any such idea in 2 stout quarto volumes is to suppose something not only very unlike the age in which he lived, but altogether unlike Cervantes himself, who would have been the first to laugh at an attempt of the sort made by anyone else. The extraordinary influence of the romances of chivalry in his day is quite enough to account for the genesis of the book. Some idea of the prodigious development of this branch of literature in the 16th century may be obtained from the scrutiny of Chapter 7, if the reader bears in mind that only a portion of the romances belonging to by far the largest group are enumerated. As to its effects on the nation, there is abundant evidence. From the time when the Almadises and the Palmerins began to grow popular down to the very end of the century, there is a steady stream of invective from men whose character and position lend weight to their words against the romances of chivalry and the infatuation of their readers. Ridicule was the only besom to sweep away that dust. That this was the task Cervantes set himself, and that he had ample provocation to urge him to do it, will be sufficiently clear to those who look into the evidence, as it will be also that it was not chivalry itself that he attacked and swept away. Of all the absurdities that, thanks to poetry, will be repeated to the end of time, there is no greater one than saying that Cervantes smiled Spain's chivalry away. In the first place, there was no chivalry for him to smile away. Spain's chivalry had been dead for more than a century. Its work was done when Granada fell, and as chivalry was essentially republican in its nature, it could not live under the rule that Ferdinand substituted for the free institutions of medieval Spain. What he did smile away was not chivalry, but a degrading mockery of it. The true nature of the right arm and the bright array, before which, according to the poet, the world gave ground, and which Cervantes' single laugh demolished, may be gathered from the words of one of his own countrymen, Don Felix Pacheco, as reported by Captain George Carleton in his Military Memoirs from 1672 through 1713. Before the appearance in the world of that labour of Cervantes, he said, it is next to an impossibility for a man to walk the streets with any delight or without danger. There were seen so many cavaliers prancing and curvetting before the windows of their mistresses, that a stranger might have imagined the whole nation to have been nothing less than a race of knight-errants. But after the world became a little acquainted with that notable history, the man that was seen in that once celebrated drapery was pointed to as a Don Quixote, and found himself the jest of high and low. And I verily believe that to this, and this only, we owe that dampness and poverty of spirit which has run through all our councils for a century past, so little agreeable to those nobler actions of our famous ancestors. To call Don Quixote a sad book, preaching a pessimist view of life, argues a total misconception of its drift. It would be so if its moral were that in this world true enthusiasm naturally leads to ridicule and discomfiture, but it preaches nothing of the sort. Its moral, so far as it can be said to have one, is that the spurious enthusiasm that is born of vanity and self-conceit, that is made an end of itself, not a means to an end, that acts on mere impulse, regardless of circumstances and consequences, is mischievous to its owner, and a very considerable nuisance to the community at large. To those who cannot distinguish between the one kind and the other, no doubt Don Quixote is a sad book. No doubt to some minds it is very sad that a man who had just uttered so beautiful a sentiment as that it is a hard case to make slaves of those whom God and nature made free, should be ungratefully pelted by the scoundrels his crazy philanthropy had let loose on society. But to others of a more judicial cast it will be a matter of regret that recklessness and self-sufficient enthusiasm is not oftener requited in some such way for all the mischief it does in the world. A very slight examination of the structure of Don Quixote will suffice to show that Cervantes had no deep design or elaborate plan in his mind when he began the book. When he wrote those lines in which, with a few strokes of a great master, he sets before us the pauper gentleman, he had no idea of the goal to which his imagination was leading him. There can be little doubt that all he contemplated was a short tale to range with those he had already written, a tale setting forth the ludicrous results that might be expected to follow the attempt of a crazy gentleman to act the part of a knight-errant in modern life. It is plain, for one thing, that Sancho Panza did not enter into the original scheme, for had Cervantes thought of him, he certainly would not have omitted him in his hero's outfit, which he obviously meant to be complete. Him we owe to the landlord's chance remark in chapter 3 that knights seldom travelled without squires. To try to think of a Don Quixote without Sancho Panza is like trying to think of a one-bladed pair of scissors. The story was written at first, like the others, without any division, and without the intervention of Cide Hamete Benigueletti, it seems not unlikely that Cervantes had some intention of bringing Dulcinea or Aldonza Lorenzo on the scene in person. It was probably the ransacking of the Don's library and the discussion on the books of chivalry that first suggested to him that his idea was capable of development. What if, instead of a mere string of farcical misadventures, he was to make his tale a burlesque of one of these books, caricaturing their style, incidents, and spirit? In pursuance of this change of plan, he hastily, and somewhat clumsily, divided what he had written into chapters on the model of Amadis, invented the fable of a mysterious Arabic manuscript, and set up Cide Hamete Beniguelli in imitation of the almost invariable practice of the chivalry romance authors who were fond of tracing their books to some recondite source. In working out the new ideas, he soon found the value of Sancho Panza. Indeed, the keynote, not only to Sancho's part, but to the whole book, is struck in the first words Sancho utters when he announces his intention of taking his ass with him. About the ass, we are told, Don Quixote hesitated a little, trying whether he could to call to mind any knight-errant taking with him a squire mounted on ass-back, but no instance occurred to his memory. We can see the whole scene at a glance, the stolid unconsciousness of Sancho, and the perplexity of his master, upon whose perception the incongruity has just forced itself. This is Sancho's mission throughout the book. He is an unconscious Mephistopheles, always unwittingly making mockery of his master's aspirations, always exposing the fallacy of his ideas by some unintentional ad absurdum, always bringing him back to the world of fact and commonplace by force of sheer stolidity. By the time Cervantes had got his volume of novels off his hands, had summoned up resolution enough to set about the second part in earnest, the case was very much altered. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza had not merely found favour, but had already become what they have never since ceased to be, veritable entities to the popular imagination. There was no occasion for him by now to interpolate extraneous matter. Nay, his readers told him plainly that what they wanted of him was more Don Quixote and more Sancho Panza, and not novels, tales, or digressions. To himself, too, his creations had become realities, and he had become proud of them, especially of Sancho. He began the second part, therefore, under very different conditions, and the difference makes itself manifest at once. Even in translation, the style will be seen to be far easier, more flowing, more natural, and more like a man sure of himself and of his audience. Don Quixote and Sancho undergo a change also. In the first part, Don Quixote has no character or individuality whatsoever. He is nothing more than a crazy representative of the sentiments of the chivalry romances. In all that he says and does, he is simply repeating the lesson he has learned from his books, and therefore it is absurd to speak of him in the gushing strain of the sentimental critics when they dilate upon his nobleness, disinterestedness, dauntless courage, and so forth. It was the business of a knight-errant to right wrongs, redress injuries, and succor the distressed, and this, as a matter of course, he makes his business when he takes up the part. A knight-errant was bound to be intrepid, and so he feels bound to cast fear aside. Of all Byron's melodious nonsense about Don Quixote, the most nonsensical statement is that "'tis his virtue makes him mad." The exact opposite is the truth. It is his madness which makes him virtuous. In the second part, Cervantes repeatedly reminds the reader, as if it was a point upon which he was anxious there be no mistake, that his hero's madness is strictly confined to delusions on the subject of chivalry, and that on every other subject he is discreto, one, in fact, whose faculty of discernment is in perfect order. The advantage of this is that he is enabled to make use of Don Quixote as a mouthpiece for his own reflections, without seeming to digress, allow himself and the relief of digression when he requires it, as freely as a commonplace book. It is true the amount of individuality bestowed upon Don Quixote is not very great. There are some natural touches of character about him, such as his mixture of irascibility and placability, and his curious affection for Sancho, together with his impatience of the squire's loquacity and impertinence. But in the main, apart from his craze, he is little more than a thoughtful, cultured gentleman, with instinctive good taste and a great deal of shrewdness and originality of mind. As to Sancho, it is plain from the concluding words of the preface to the first part that he was a favorite with his creator even before he had been taken into favor by the public. An inferior genius, taking him in hand a second time, would very likely have tried to improve him by making him more comical, clever, amiable, or virtuous. But Cervantes was too true an artist to spoil his work this way. Sancho, when he reappears, is the old Sancho with the old familiar features, but with a difference. They have been brought out more distinctly, but at the same time with a careful avoidance of anything like caricature. The outline has been filled in where filling in was necessary, and vivified by a few touches of the master's hand. Sancho stands before us as he might in a character portrait by Velázquez. He is a much more important and prominent figure in the second part than in the first. Indeed, it is his matchless mendacity about Dulcinea that to a great extent supplies the action of the story. His development in this respect is as remarkable as any other. In the first part he displays a great natural gift of lying. His lies are not of the highly imaginable sort that liars in fiction commonly indulge in, like Falstaffs. They resemble the father that begets them. They are simple, homely, plump lies, plain working lies, in short. But in the service of such a master as Don Quixote he develops rapidly, as we see when he comes to palm off the three country wenches as Dulcinea and her ladies-in-waiting. It is worth noticing how, flushed by his success in this instance, he is tempted afterwards to try a flight beyond his powers in his account of the journey on Clavinello. In the second part it is the spirit, rather than the incidents of the chivalry romances, that is the subject of the burlesque. Enchantments of the sort travestied in those of Dulcinea and the Trifaldi, and the Cave of Montesinos, play a leading part in the later and inferior romances, and another distinguishing feature is caricatured in Don Quixote's blind adoration of Dulcinea. In the romances of chivalry, love is either a mere animalism or a fantastic idolatry. Only a coarse-minded man would care to make merry with the former, but to one of Cervantes' humour the latter was naturally an attractive subject for ridicule. Like everything else in these romances, it is a gross exaggeration of the real sentiment of chivalry, but its peculiar extravagance is probably due to the influence of those masters of hyperbole, the Provençal poets. When a troubadour professed his readiness to obey his lady in all things, he made it incumbent upon the next comer, if he wished to avoid the imputation of tameness and commonplace, to declare himself the slave of her will, which the next was compelled to cap by some still stronger declaration, and so expressions of devotion went on rising one above the other like biddings at an auction, and a conventional language of gallantry and theory of love came into being that in time permeated the literature of southern Europe, and bore fruit in one direction in the transcendental worship of Beatrice and Laura, and in another in the grotesque idolatry which found exponents in writers like Feliciano de Silva. This is what Cervantes deals with in Don Quixote's passion for Dulcinea, and in no instance has he carried out the burlesque more happily. By keeping Dulcinea in the background, and making her a vague, shadowy being, of whose very existence we are left in doubt, he invests Don Quixote's worship of her virtues and charms with an additional extravagance, and gives still more point to the caricature of the sentiment and language of the romances. One of the great merits of Don Quixote, and one of the qualities that have secured its acceptance by all classes of readers and made it the most cosmopolitan of books, is its simplicity. There are, of course, points obvious enough to a Spanish 17th century audience which do not immediately strike a reader nowadays, and Cervantes often takes it for granted that an allusion will be generally understood, which is only intelligible to a few. For example, on many of his readers in Spain, and most of his readers out of it, the significance of his choice of a country for his hero is completely lost. It would be going too far to say that no one can thoroughly comprehend Don Quixote without having seen La Mancha. But undoubtedly even a glimpse of La Mancha will give an insight into the meaning of Cervantes such as no commentator can give. Of all the regions in Spain, it is the last that would suggest the idea of romance. Of all the dull central plateau of the peninsula, it is the dullest tract. There is something impressive about the grim solitudes of Estremadura, and if the plains of Leon and the old Castile are bald and dreary, they are studded with old cities renowned in history and rich in landscape. It has all the sameness of the desert without its dignity. The few towns and villages that break its monotony are mean and commonplace. There is nothing venerable about them. They have not even the picturesqueness of poverty. Indeed, Don Quixote's own village, Argamasilla, has a sort of oppressive respectability in the prim regularity of its streets and houses. Everything is ignoble. The very windmills are the ugliest and shabbiest of all the windmill kind. To anyone who knows the country well, the mere style and title of Don Quixote of La Mancha gave the key to the author's meaning at once. La Mancha, as the knight's country and scene of his chivalries, is a piece with the pasteboard helmet, the farm labourer on ass-back for a squire, knighthood conferred by a rascally ventero, convicts taken for victims of oppression, and the rest of the incongruities between Don Quixote's world and the world he lived in, between things as he saw them and things as they were. It is strange that this element of incongruity, underlying the whole humor and purpose of the book, should have been so little heeded by the majority of those who have undertaken to interpret Don Quixote. It has been completely overlooked, for example, by the illustrators. To be sure, the great majority of the artists who illustrated Don Quixote knew nothing whatever of Spain. To them, a venta conveyed no idea but the abstract one of a roadside inn, and they could not therefore do full justice to the humor of Don Quixote's misconception in taking it for a castle, or perceive the remoteness of all its realities from his ideal. But even when better informed, they seem to have no apprehension of the full force of the discrepancy. Take, for instance, Gustave Doré's drawing of Don Quixote watching his armor in an inn-yard. Whether or not the Venta de Quesada on the Seville road is, as tradition maintains, the inn described in Don Quixote, beyond all question it was just such an inn-yard as the one behind it that Cervantes had in his mind's eye, and it was on just such a rude stone trough as that beside the primitive draw-well in the corner that he meant Don Quixote to deposit his armor. Gustave Doré makes an elaborate fountain, which as no arriero ever watered his mules at the corral of any venta in Spain, and thereby entirely misses the point aimed at by Cervantes. It is the mean, prosaic, commonplace character of all the surroundings and circumstances that gives a significance to Don Quixote's vigil and the ceremony that follows. Cervantes' humor is, for the most part, of that broader and simpler sort, the strength of which lies in the perception of the incongruous. It is the incongruity of Sancho in all his ways, works, and words, with the ideas and aims of his master, quite as much as the wonderful vitality and truth-to-nature of the character, that makes him the most humorous creation in the whole range of fiction. That unsmiling gravity of which Cervantes was the first great master, Cervantes' serious air, which sits naturally on Swift alone, perhaps, of later humorists, is essential to this kind of humor, and here again Cervantes has suffered at the hands of his interpreters. Nothing, unless indeed the coarse buffoonery of Phillips, could be more out of place in an attempt to represent Cervantes than a flippant, would-be facetious style like that of Motteux's version, for example, or the sprightly, jaunty air French translators sometimes adopt. It is the grave matter-of-factness of the narrative, and the apparent unconsciousness of the author that he is saying anything ludicrous, anything but the merest commonplace, that give its peculiar flavor to the humor of Cervantes. His, in fact, is the exact opposite of the humor of Sterne and the self-conscious humorists. Even when Uncle Toby is at his best, you are always aware of the man Sterne behind him, watching you over his shoulder to see what effect he is producing. Cervantes always leaves you alone with Don Quixote and Sancho. He and Swift and the great humorists have always kept themselves out of sight, or, more literally speaking, never think about themselves at all, unlike our latter-day school of humorists, who seem to have revived the old horse-collar method, and try to raise a laugh by some grotesque assumption of ignorance, imbecility, or bad taste. It is true that to do full justice to Spanish humor in any other language is well-nigh an impossibility. There is a natural gravity and a sonorous stateliness about Spanish, be it ever so colloquial, that make an absurdity doubly absurd, and give plausibility to the most preposterous statement. This is what makes Sancho Panza's drollery the despair of the conscientious translator. Sancho's curt comments can never fall flat, but they lose half their flavor when transferred from their native Castilian into any other medium. But if foreigners have failed to do justice to the humor of Cervantes, they are no worse than his own countrymen. Indeed, were it not for the Spanish peasant's relish of Don Quixote, one might be tempted to think that the great humorist was not looked upon as a humorist at all in his own country. The craze of Don Quixote seems in some instances to have communicated itself to his critics, making them see things that are not in the book, and run full tilt at phantoms that have no existence save in their own imaginations. Like a good many critics nowadays, they forget that screams are not criticism, and that it is only vulgar tastes that are influenced by strings and superlatives, three-piled hyperboles, and while they deal in extravagant eulogies, and ascribe all manner of imaginary ideas and qualities to Cervantes, they show no perception of the quality that 99 out of 100 of his readers would rate highest about him, and hold to be the one that raises him above all rivalry. To speak of Don Quixote as if it were merely a humorous book would be a manifest misdescription. Cervantes at times makes it a kind of commonplace book for occasional essays and criticisms, or for the observations and reflections and gathered wisdom of a long and stirring life. It is a mine of shrewd observation on mankind and human nature. Among modern novels there may be, here and there, more elaborate studies of character, but there is no book richer in individualized character. Whatever Coleridge said of Shakespeare in Minimus is true of Cervantes. He never, even for the most temporary purpose, puts forward a lay figure. There is life and individuality in all his characters, however little they may have to do, or however short a time they may be before the reader. Samson Carrasco, the curate, Teresa Panza, Altisidora, even the two students met on the road in the cave to Montesinos, all live and move and have their being, and it is characteristic of the broad humanity of Cervantes that there is not a hateful one among them all. Even poor Maritornes, with her deplorable morals, has a kind heart of her own, and some faint and distant resemblance to a Christian about her. And as for Sancho, though on dissection we fail to find a lovable trait in him, unless it be a sort of dog-like affection for his master, who is there that in his heart does not love him? But it is, after all, the humour of Don Quixote that distinguishes it from all other books of the romance kind. It is this that makes it, as one of the most judicial-minded of modern critics calls it, the best novel in the world beyond all comparison. It is its varied humour, ranging from broad farce to comedy as subtle as Shakespeare's or Molière's, that has naturalized it in every country where there are readers, and made it a classic in every language that has a literature. So ends the translator's preface.